Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of civil services examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 14th of September 2021. The articles which we are going to discuss today have been displayed on your screen, and let us now begin the discussion. In Manipur, a case for asymmetric federalism appears on page number 7, where the author says that institutionally accommodating tribal distinctiveness as an enduring goodwill promotes the state's integrity. Now, this article has been published in context of Manipur Hill Areas Autonomous District Council Amendment Bill 2021, which was introduced in the Manipur Assembly. People from hill areas of Manipur are protesting against the bill because this bill dilutes the power of the district council and ultimately gives plain area people a more say in affairs of hill areas. And so in this regard, the author makes a claim for further strengthening the kind of asymmetric federalism which India has adopted. So federalism means power sharing between regional units and central unit, whereas asymmetric federalism means that this sharing of power will be different for everyone. Depending upon history, geography and special local circumstances, this power sharing will be modified. For example, Jammu Kashmir had traditionally enjoyed very special status when it comes to center-state relationship. Similarly, under Article 371 A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, there are a lot of states which observe a modification of the federalism observed by other states. And so in this regard, we are going to first understand the federalism and what is the need for federalism, what is India's unique federalism with unitary bias and asymmetry, and then finally we are going to look into these articles starting from 371 to 371G, look into these states and what are the modifications which have been provided in the Constitution of India. The bill which the authors mention, the bill of the Manipuri Legislative Assembly, which the author mentions, is not important from the perspective of civil services examination. But what is important is the larger issues of asymmetric federalism which this bill has raised. So let us now begin the discussion.
Now, before going into federalism as a word, let us now first understand why is there a need for a country to adopt a federal system of government. Now, if you look at the countries across the world, they come in all shapes and sizes. They are made up of many different types of people from various kinds of backgrounds trying to live together as a nation. Now, how do we ensure that all these diverse people get sufficient political representation? And one of the ways to enable people from different backgrounds to live together is federalism. So put very simply, federalism is a system of government in which the power is divided between a central authority and multiple regional authorities. Now someone might ask, why is there a need to create two levels of government and how is it going to exactly help people from diverse backgrounds in living together as one nation? And the simple answer is by sharing their power over the things they have in common, like the trade with the outside world or international trade. So a group of people, let's say A, B, C, they could be different in terms of language, ethnicity, but they see themselves as one as compared to the outside world. And so as far as international trade is concerned, they would want to deal with that as an entity together. Or for example, they want to fend off a foreign attack. They want to draw a boundary, an international boundary. For that purpose, they would like to see themselves as one, and so they would give up their powers on these matters and create a central authority known as center, which will look after these matters. But at the same time, these groups maintain some level of self-rule over those things that are not common. For example, education, primary health care, or for that matter, broadcasting. Each of A, B and C would want to deal with these matters independently, and for that they would like to keep that power to themselves in the regional government. And so over the years, federalism has been recognized as the best system of the government to protect diversity in a population, because you have given powers to themselves to manage their own affairs in a lot of things. And for specifically doing this, you need first and foremost a written constitution which is not very easy to change, which is some kind of a rigid constitution which cannot be amended by parliament or by the central legislature. The constitution itself should create two levels of government. So right now I want your utmost attention. There are a lot of countries, for example China, which also has local governments. But still China is not a federal government because the constitution of China does not guarantees the perpetuation of these regional territories. You need these states to have existence independent of the center. And so the constitution creates two governments and itself divides the power between the center and the regional territories. Only then it will become a federation. And the best example of that would be United States of America, would be India, would be Australia, and also Canada. All these four nations are examples of federation, but the way the federations are arranged vary a lot from one country to another. So now let us look into the features which actually make India a federation or a federal state. So we know that India has a written constitution, of course, and India also creates two sets of government. So India has a system of dual government, one government in Delhi and multiple governments in states. Then if there is a dispute between a center and state or a group of states, we know that it is the constitution which is going to prevail, not state government or legislature or parliament and central government, because the constitution is supreme in our country. And so this is the mechanism which has been enacted to defend the rights of the states. But you simply cannot defend the rights of the states if you do not have independent judiciary, independent both of state governments and central government. And that is one of the reasons behind creation of independent judiciary. At the same time, we also want representation of the states at the center, in the central parliament. And that is why you have two sets of houses, Lok Sabha as the representation of the common people and Rajya Sabha or the Council of States as the representation of the views of the states. And so clearly you can see that India is a federation. But at the same time, there are a lot of provisions of the Constitution of India which actually deviate the Federation of India from true federal structure. For example, in case of India, the central government is pretty strong and so is parliament. India has a single constitution which is unlike the true federal structures across the world. It does not offer dual citizenship. If you are a citizen of India, you are a citizen of India. And unlike other federal states, for example US, you are not a citizen of a state. You could be a resident of a state, but you are a citizen of India. At the same time, the constitution is written, but it's quite flexible. And majority of the provision of the constitution can be amended by the parliament itself. At the same time, the constitution provides wide powers to the central government and parliament to convert the federal structure into unitary structure or a unitary system at any point they want. Of course, it will not be perpetuated for a very long time, but for short durations utilizing emergency provisions, the parliament and central government can do that. Then even at the state level, the appointment of governor, the head of the state, is appointed by the central government, and central government through governor controls a lot of things in the states. One of those things is veto over state bills. And so it is exactly because of these two reasons, because of the balance between the true federalism and unitary system, India is known as a unique experiment which is federation with unitary bias. But even given the federation, the kind of federation which India has, do you think that all the states possess equal power? Or some states have more power than others? Or some states have more autonomy than others have? And if you think that is the case with India, then we have to add one more word over here. It's just not federation with unitary bias, but also it has a level of asymmetry, which basically means that not all states are equally situated from the center when it comes to the distribution of power, which is what is the main theme of today's editorial as well. And so now we are going to deal into asymmetric federalism, where different units, due to various local, historical or geographical factors, share different power with the center. For example, Sikkim was assimilated into our country later on. And so we wanted to protect the original laws of Sikkim, which were enacted by Sikkim when it was not a part of India. We wanted to protect those laws from being annulled by the Supreme Court, and so we had to provide a special protection. And so this kind of power sharing with Sikkim would be very different from, let's say, that of Uttar Pradesh, where all the laws will have to abide by the features of the Constitution of India. On the other hand, state like Manipur has a clearly defined population divide between people living in valley areas and those living in hill areas. So where the population of people living in valley is much more, the population and hence the vote bank of the people living in hill areas is very less. And so to especially take care of the people living in hill areas, it was expected of the constitution to design some framework which is different for Manipur. At the same time, some of the tribes like Naga tribes would still not find it convenient to be governed by CRPC, IPC or general religious codes of India, and so they would want to modify either these codes if they are applied to them, or they would want their own customary law to be applicable in near future. And so there is a need to modify the center and state relation to suit to very local and special condition. It cannot be extended to everyone, but it should be extended to all those people who are specially in very less number to protect their rights. And so Indian Constitution also has a lot of asymmetric federalism, which have been given in Article 370, which has been diluted. We know it is for Jammu and Kashmir. And then you have Article 371 A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and special provisions in a very succinct manner have been noted down on your screen. If you go to the original Constitution and try to read these articles, you may not be able to understand this. And so the states which currently enjoy special status as far as their relationship with center is concerned are Maharashtra and Gujarat, Nagaland, Assam, Andhra Pradesh, Manipur, Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh and Mizoram. Apart from them, the 6 scheduled areas in our country which belong to 4 states also see some kind of modification between their center and state relationship. And so let us now look into the kind of modifications which have been done in these states. So Article 371, which deals with Maharashtra and Gujarat, says that the governor of Maharashtra has a special responsibility to establish separate development boards for Vidarbha, Marathwada and for rest of the region of the state, while the governor of the Gujarat has similar responsibility towards Saurashtra, Kutch and rest of the Gujarat. So you know that governor has certain responsibilities under the Constitution of India. But this responsibility of the governor of Maharashtra and governor of Gujarat to constitute boards for these 3 regions, Vidarbha, Maharashtra and rest of the Maharashtra, Saurashtra, Kutch and rest of the Gujarat, is a special responsibility which has been endowed only to 2 governors, which is very different from other governors of the country. And so it is an asymmetric federalism. Similarly, when we talk about Nagaland, the provisions with respect to which have been given in Article 371A, which confers special status on Nagaland. Under this provision, no law made by Parliament in relation to Naga customary law, be it criminal or civil, ownership and transfer of resources, will apply to Nagaland unless and until it has been approved by the Legislative Assembly. So now you can easily see the major modification over here. We see that whenever Parliament passes a law in concurrent list, we know that civil and criminal procedure come under the list 3 of the Schedule 7, and Parliament has the power to pass such laws. But if such a law is passed which interferes with criminal and civil procedure and ownership and transfer of resources, then it will not be directly applicable to the people of Nagaland unless and until they are approved by the Legislative Assembly of Nagaland, which is unlike the case with any other state. And also, Article 371A did not originally exist in the Constitution of India. The protection of Naga laws and customs was written into the Constitution following July 1960 agreement between the Centre and Naga People's Convention, under which the state was later created. Further, the governor of Nagaland has a special responsibility regarding law and order of the state. Then Article 371B contained a special provision for Assam, under which a committee of legislators from the tribal area was to be formed to look into the interest of tribal people. The tribal areas later on became Meghalaya state, and so there is not much use of this article. But Article 371, which deals with the state of Manipur, especially hill areas of Manipur, is very important. Because under Article 371C, the hill areas of Manipur ought to have a committee of legislators. And governor has a special responsibility to make an annual report to the president on the administration of these hill areas. The center is empowered to give directions to the state so far as these areas are concerned. Then Article 371D originally dealt with only Andhra Pradesh, but of course after the division of the state into Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, it now includes the provision for both the states. And it basically deals with the inequity or the expectation of inequity as far as public employment opportunities are concerned. And so it provided that president can order to provide equitable opportunities and facilities to people belonging to different parts of the state in public employment and education. In particular, the president can create local cadres in various classes of employment and allocate civil posts to specified local cadres only. So this was the provision which was provided in the constitution. Now think about it. If a state government of Madhya Pradesh wants to create local cadre and wants to reserve certain posts only for local cadres, will it be possible? It will not be possible, because this is what asymmetric federalism looks like. Then Article 371F deals with the state of Sikkim, which incorporated special provision after the addition of Sikkim to India. One major objective was to grant protection to existing laws in Sikkim so that they are not declared unconstitutional after being brought under the Constitution of India. Similarly, Article 371G deals with the state of Mizoram. It contains special provision to preserve religious and social practices of Mizos in Mizoram and their customary law and procedure and administration of criminal and civil justice, besides ownership of land transfer. So you can see that these provisions are quite similar to that of Nagaland. And Article 371H deals with Arunachal Pradesh, which vests a special responsibility on the governor of Arunachal Pradesh with respect to maintenance of law and order in this state. It makes it clear that the governor shall discharge this function after consulting the Council of Ministers, but she can exercise her individual judgment as to the action taken as far as it deals with the maintenance of law and order. Now, you can clearly understand when it comes to other states, she works on aid and advice of Council of Ministers. And there are very few areas on which governors can exercise their own discretion. And of course, law and order is not one of those things where governor is expected to perform his or her discretionary functions. But in case of Arunachal Pradesh, it has been specifically mentioned in the constitution that they can exercise individual judgment as far as maintenance of law and order in Arunachal Pradesh is concerned. So now you can see that this is a very significant modification when it comes to federalism. Congress questions CONCOR divestment. And this question has been raised because the Container Corporation of India has been earning profits in past 10 years. And this is not the first time, and definitely will not be the last time, when the questions have been raised on divestment policy of the Government of India. The divestment of public resources, the public sector undertaking companies, has always been a very debatable issue. It's just not a burning political issue, but a very important topic from the perspective of civil services mains examination. Because mobilization of resources is a part of the syllabus. Now when you think about divestment, why is Government of India divesting these firms? Because it wants to earn revenues. It wants to mobilize the resources so that these resources can be invested in various other fields. And so in this regard, it is very important for us to get a deeper insights into divestment. And so in the article that follows, we are going to discuss divestment, various kinds of disinvestment processes, what are the benefits because of which they are being done, but what are the serious challenges which the government will have to address in order to carry out successful divestment policy without a speck of doubt. Let us now begin the discussion. So in order to understand the disinvestment, you will first have to go back in time. Go back at the time of the independence, where the Government of India adopted a socialist kind of economy. And so because of that, most of the industrial activity in our country was allocated or reserved for public sector, as it was called the commanding heights of the economy. We all know that, right? And so for the first 4 decades after independence, India pursued a path of development in which the public sector was expected to be the engine of India's growth, economic growth. And so it was just a matter of time before it was realized that these public sector undertakings or public sector enterprises or these government companies were proving out to be quite ineffective. There was a drastic decline in the net worth of these companies as well as their net profits. There was very low return on assets and equity, and also the gross revenues of these companies were sharply falling. Apart from these, there were other issues related to corruption, low work ethics, overcapitalization due to substantial time and cost overruns. And so because of these factors, these public sector undertakings became a loss-making firms. They were perpetually in loss. So even if you look at the losses incurred by Air India, there is a massive infusion of cash every year by the government of India just to keep Air India afloat. And this is a big problem because the money fueling these public sector undertakings come from the revenues earned by the government. Government has to allocate these resources to run these companies. And so when came 1991, people started questioning the participation of government in business. Because people started to wonder that if most of the jobs done by public sector undertakings, for example, flying aircrafts, manufacturing watches, production of electricity, when all these things can be easily taken care of by the private sector, why is there a need for the government to involve itself into these businesses and complicate its overall functioning? And so that is where the disinvestment comes into play. Because disinvestment means sale of assets by the government. So if the government controls 100% of a company, let's say a company A, and so there could be a lot of ways in which the government can decide to liquidate its equity. For example, as you can see, there is one method which is called minority disinvestment, through which the government retains a majority stake in the company, typically greater than 51%, thus ensuring the management control over that company. But rest 49% or less than that is sold to the private sector. Then there is another kind of disinvestment, which is majority disinvestment, where post disinvestment, the government retains minority stake in the company. So although the government will have shares of that company, but the government will not have control over the management of the company. And then finally, the privatization or complete disinvestment, wherein the 100% control of the company is passed on to a private sector buyer. And so as and when the idea of disinvestment crept into India's policy making, 3 phases of disinvestment can be easily identified. So after 1991, the first phase of disinvestment was sale of minority stake in bundles through auction, as we have just discussed. Then came the second phase, separate sale of each PSU. And then finally, of late, that is in last 5 to 10 years, we are in the era of privatization, which means either selling of the majority stake and the management control over the company. So you can say that it is basically transfer of ownership and control of a public sector entity to some other private entity. And so that is where the strategic disinvestment comes into play, because of course it comes with a lot of advantages. So one direct advantage which has not been written in the slides is of course that the sale of these massive public sector undertakings is going to earn a lot of revenues for the government. But that is just one time. That is not something which can be perpetuated for a very long time. And so that is why it has not been written, because these advantages of privatization or strategic disinvestment are long-lasting ones. And so let us understand them. So first and foremost is that strategic disinvestment has a very long lasting impact on labor productivity and overall efficiency of the company, because it has been observed that post privatization, the performance of privatized entity improves significantly in terms of net worth, net profit, return on assets, return on equity, as well as on gross revenues. As we have discussed, this has been a cause of concern as far as these PSUs are concerned, and it has been observed that whenever public sector undertakings are privatized, all these parameters get significantly improved. And because government has sold its loss-making public sector undertaking, the allocation, the capital allocation on behalf of the government improves significantly. Because if government is not doing business, then that means all the energy, attention as well as the capital resources of the government have been directed towards sectors in which only government can act. For example, law and order, social services, providing to the needs of vulnerable sections, isn't it? And so when government takes its attention away from these business entities, you basically have a scenario where government is doing what only government can do and businesses are doing what only businesses should do. And so that is why it improves the overall efficiency of the economy as well. Then massive participation of private sector in any field has multiplier effect on other sectors. And when the government monopolies end and a lot of private players are allowed to participate in particular field, it leads to competition. Enhanced competition ultimately benefits the consumers. And as we have discussed, the issues of work culture, corruption, and many other factors are addressed because private sector comes with a lot of professionalism. And professionalism in management of any entity is a prerequisite for its success, which is a major demerit with the public sector undertakings. And so when we talk about so many advantages of privatization or strategic disinvestment, do we have any data to substantiate this fact? Yes, of course we have. Because if you remember, earlier the telecom sector as well as the airways sector was monopolized by the government. So 20 years ago, no private company could provide telecom services or could fly its aircraft in the air in India. And so later on, these sectors were opened for private sector. What you see in telecom is that there is a significant reduction in tariffs benefiting the consumers. And also, if you look at how the usage of data and adoption of 4G, how rapid it has been, that is only because of high level of participation of private sector. Had it been only in the control of the government, this would not have been possible. Similarly, if you look at airways, there is a drop in fares after the participation of the private sector. At the same time, the quality of the services have improved. Apart from that, there is an increase in the connectivity as far as overall Indian map is concerned. So these are the two case studies you can cite to demonstrate the past success of opening up of a public sector to the private entity. But this idea of privatization on paper looks very, very good. On experience also it looks very good. But some of the very valid criticisms have been raised by various political as well as economic thinkers. And let us discuss them. So first and foremost is that not all public sector companies are loss making. There are a lot of massive profit making public sector undertakings as well. And so when the government has decided to go for massive privatization, and if the government sells the profit making and dividend paying PSUs to the private sector, this would result in the loss of regular income to the government. Because when the government goes for privatization, it gets massive sums of money, but that is only once. But if a public sector undertaking is making profits year on year, that is a regular income for many decades. And so at this point of time, the government should not be selling the profit making and dividend paying PSUs. Then there are questions related to strategic and national security concerns. Because the strategic disinvestment of oil PSUs can be seen by some of the experts as a threat to national security, because we all know that oil is a strategic natural resource. And the ownership of these resources in the hands of private sector, in which foreign players could also be involved, could threaten India's energy security and hence could become a strategic and national security concern. And this is just one of the examples. There are other sectors also, if privatized, could lead to these kinds of concern. Then there are concerns related to cronyism. Because when government decides to sell its company to a private player, the ownership is completely transferred. And so it becomes important that the government follows complete transparency in the way this ownership is transferred. And then there are threats of asset stripping. Because we know that these public sector undertakings, apart from their main businesses, have very valuable assets. For example, land in prime locations, investments in plants and machineries, buildings. And so when these PSUs are sold, the government loses control over those assets as well. And so there are a lot of concerns related to that as well. And so the question arises as to what should the government do? So of course the answer lies in the issues. So the government should not immediately sell the profit-making and dividend-paying PSUs. Then some of the sectors should be identified as core sectors or the sectors of national interest, which should never be privatized. Then A very transparent and accountable process should be adopted while selling these assets to the private sector, so that no one can raise questions over the ingenuity of the government to sell these assets. And then finally, a lot of assets held with these public sector undertakings should be identified, and a proper decision should be taken whether or not to sell these assets along with the PSUs or not. So this discussion becomes very important from the perspective of GS paper 3, where you could be expected to understand not only the disinvestment process, why is it needed, what are its advantages, and then finally there are some issues as well. Let us now move on to the next discussion. Inflation dips marginally to 5.3% in August appears on page number 1. India's retail inflation cooled to 5.3% from 5.6% in July. Now, inflation is one of the very important determinants of economic growth. And not just economic growth, but the growth of UPSC aspirants as well. Because just look at this instance from 2020 prelims examination, where UPSC asks, consider the following statements. Statement 1. The weightage of food in Consumer Price Index CPI is higher than that in Wholesale Price Index known as WPI. Statement 2. The WPI does not capture changes in the prices of services which CPI does. Statement 3. Reserve Bank of India has now adopted WPI as its key measure of inflation and to decide on changing the key policy rates. Which of the statement given above are correct? And now you can easily understand how inflation becomes important for UPSC, especially the prelims stage as well. And let me assure you that this is not very easy question. It requires you to have a clear-cut understanding of CPI, WPI and how they are different. And so we will begin with that comparison, and then we will go on and understand how we calculate inflation, and then what are the factors which are driving the current inflation rate in our country. And let me tell you this important coincidence. In the DNS dated 4th of January 2020, which is like 8 months before the prelims examination, we discussed this chart which has all the information it takes to solve this question. And so we'll start the discussion with the same comparison chart between WPI and CPI. So WPI is measure of inflation at the wholesale level, whereas CPI is the measure of inflation at the retail level. So you know that buyers exist both at the consumer level, which we form important part, because we don't go to the wholesale market for vegetables. We go to the local retailer or the grocery shop. Whereas the business people, the people who are involved in business, have to go to the wholesale market. And so the markets exist at two levels, and hence the inflation exists for these two different markets. And so that is why the calculation of WPI is done by Ministry of Commerce and Industry, because that is not something which is impacting the consumer directly. Of course, indirectly it does. But that is an easy way to remember who calculates WPI, because it is for wholesale market, and so Commerce and Industry Ministry is the one concerned with it. Whereas the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, is calculated by National Statistical Office or NSO under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. For both of them, the base year is 2011-12 and 2012. Now, the basket of goods under the WPI is different from basket of CPI. Because under WPI, you have primary articles, manufactured products and fuel and power. And highest weightage is given to manufactured products. Whereas if you look at CPI, the one which is consumed or centered around consumers, consists of what we consumes or what we spend maximum on, which is food and beverages, pan, tobacco and intoxicants, clothing and footwear, housing, fuel and light, miscellaneous, which includes services of education and healthcare, and transportation, which is also a service. But the highest weightage is given to food and beverages. So on an average, an Indian household has the maximum expenditure on food and beverages, and that is why highest weightage has been given in the CPI to this particular category. Now, when the food prices increase, which is what is happening now, will it impact WPI the same way as it does CPI? Of course no, because you can see that the highest weightage is given to manufactured product, and so the impact of increase in food items is less on WPI as compared to CPI, since the WPI provides higher weightage to manufactured products and lower weightage to food items. Whereas the impact of increase in food items would be much wider on CPI because it has the highest weightage of foodstuffs. Now, as you can clearly see, there is no health, education and transportation here, and so Under WPI, there is no service sector which is included, but it forms an important part of the CPI. Under WPI, there is no inclusion of taxes, whereas CPI has the inclusion of taxes. Now, we know that RBI has been given a mandate to maintain the inflation rate between 2 to 6% or 4% plus minus 2%. Now, what is this value, whether it is WPI or CPI? Now, the government does not want the average consumer to face the inflation at a very high rate. And so, it makes sense that RBI is required to maintain CPI rate of inflation of 4% with a deviation of 2%, whereas RBI does not take into account WPI. So, RBI targets inflation rate, which is CPI. And so, let us now go back to the Prelims 2020 question and try to solve it. The weightage of food in consumer price index is higher than that in WPI, which is correct. We have seen that. WPI does not capture changes in prices of services, which CPI does, which is also correct. RBI has now adopted WPI. No, this is wrong because RBI has adopted CPI as its key measure of inflation and to decide on changing the key policy rate. And so the statement 1 and 2 are correct, leading us to the right answer A. And so often students ask about the base effect. What is this base effect? Now, to understand the base effect, we'll have to go through some calculations. You know that rate of inflation in current year depends on the rate of inflation in the previous year because the rate of inflation is equal to prices in the current month minus prices in corresponding month of the previous year divided by prices in the corresponding month of previous year into 100. And so, if the prices were very high in the same month last year, which means that denominator would have high value and so you will have low rate of inflation because of base effect. Similarly, if the prices were very low, unusually low in the same month last year, your denominator will be low and hence your rate of inflation will be high because of the base effect. And so let us understand these two scenarios. Under scenario 1, let's say the price of an item A in 2019 May is 100 rupees and in May 2020 it is 150 rupees and in May 2021 they have increased to 200 rupees. So how are you going to calculate the inflation? For the first year, inflation would be calculated for May 2020. It would be done in a way by applying this formula. Prices in current month, which is 150, minus prices in corresponding month of the previous year, which is 100, divided by prices in corresponding month of the previous year divided by 100, which is 50 by 100, which is 50% inflation. And similarly, if you apply the same formula, it comes out to be 33.33%, because then you are going to subtract 150 from 200 and divide it by 150 into 100. Again, to show you how the base effect changes the whole game, you have the same starting point and the same ending point, but the middle point is different. So let's say for an item B, it starts at 100 just like item A, but in May 2020 it was 110. So rate of inflation was 10%. In May 2021, the prices have gone up to 200, just as the way item A has gone. But item A has 33.33% inflation rate, whereas item B has 81.81% inflation rate, just owing to the base effect, because the base would be 110 in this case and 150 in this case. And so this is what is known as base effect. And so let us now quickly understand the reasons behind the inflation in our country right now. And there are 4 reasons behind that. Imported inflation, increase in certain food items prices, increase in services prices, and low base effect, which we just understood. So increase in global commodity prices such as crude oil, edible oil, all of us are feeling this particular instance of higher crude prices. And so since most of the things are being transported on crude oil, and so of course the increase in the prices of petrol and diesel would be reflected in everything else. Similarly, there are certain food items which are getting expensive, for example, eggs, edible oils, fruits and pulses. Similarly, the prices of health, transport and communication sector services have gone up, and we know that services are included in CPI. And due to lockdown last year, the prices of most of the goods had declined because of the low demand. And so that is why we have low base effect, which would reflect in higher inflation prices. Also, at the same time, aspirants often come across such terms such as headline and core inflation. Now, headline inflation simply refers to the inflation in the CPI or even the WPI, covering all the categories of goods and services. So that is complete CPI and WPI. But on the other hand, the core inflation excludes the volatile categories, such as food, fuel, in order to measure the increase in the prices of goods and services in general. So you know that due to various reasons, some or the other component of CPI and WPI would deviate from the general trend. So for example, if the rate of inflation in general is low, but for let's say sudden reduction in rainfall, the prices of vegetables shoot up. But that is quite temporary, but that will take up the overall inflation trend high in that particular month. But that is not what is the general trend, and that general trend is called the core inflation. And so a drastic fall in the food and fuel prices can bring down the headline inflation by a large extent. However, the core inflation may remain unaffected. So don't get confused. RBI right now is targeting CPI headline rate of inflation, which is the complete CPI and not the core inflation. Now, a debate which has cropped up in last 2 years is that what should be actually targeted by RBI, whether it is headline, which is what is RBI doing right now, or should it resort to targeting the core inflation, because which is what is the normal trend. And so in this regard, Economic Survey has highlighted that the sole focus on CPI headline rate of inflation may not be appropriate on account of number of reasons. And accordingly, it has recommended that a greater focus on core inflation is warranted because of 4 specific reasons. First, headline inflation may take place due to volatility in prices of crude oil and food commodities over which RBI has no control. For example, failure of monsoon, lack of cold chain infrastructure, supply side bottlenecks usually lead to increase in food prices. And accordingly, RBI changes its monetary policy, which is going to have no impact on this particular inflation. Similarly, increase in crude oil prices, the import of crude oil prices is not connected with the monetary policy of RBI. But RBI is changing its monetary policy as a result of these increase in prices. Then second, most of the time inflation in food commodities is transitory and may not require any policy change by RBI. It could be just a 1-month phenomena. But RBI comes up with a policy for 3 months, and so that could not be justified. Third, if the RBI tries to control inflation due to volatility in prices of food commodities, it can prove to be counterproductive. For example, to control inflation, rate of interest would increase, which will lead to decline in investment and consumption expenditure, which will result in economic slowdown. And lastly, to measure inflation correctly, weightage must be assigned to different categories of commodities depending upon their share in the household expenditure. Higher the share, higher should be the weightage. And the share of food commodities in household expenditure has declined since 2011-12. Yet the CPI gives a weightage of around 45% to food commodities, as we have already seen. So I hope with this discussion, it was clear to you as to what the inflation, especially the WPI and CPI differences, headline and core differences, and how the base effect impacts the rate of inflation. Let us now move on to the question of the day.